So this is interesting information because it shows that Russia, in the face of Western sanctions, is really more or less just coalescing with the rest of this BRICS sort of group, economic group, which stands for Brazil, Russia, India, China, and South Africa. And it's really I guess, alternative economic sort of grouping to opposed to relying on the United States and the West at large. And this is a very predictable outcome of the sanctions that we put on Russia at the start of their war with Ukraine. And despite whatever you think, I guess, regardless of whatever you might think about Ukraine and the Russia war, it's it is a it's not something we haven't done. If you'll recall our long and storied history of invading every country um, that we can get our hands on. Uh, you might wonder why we took such a hard line, and it's because Ukraine is a money laundering pit. But the fallout of it, from an economic standpoint, is what I think is interesting here, and at least worth bringing to people's attention. So it started off here saying the recent BRICS summit managed to run its course the past week with very little fanfare, despite the fact that Russia, in the midst of a conflict with Ukraine, has led to a worldwide economic war. China is edging towards potential invasion of Taiwan, and much of the planet is in the middle of stagflationary crisis in the meantime. One major takeaway from the summit was the reaffirmed stance of the BRICS that they would continue to work closely with Russia in economic terms. And you've seen this recently as far as the sort of development of an alternative currency to the petrodollar for buying oil, not just from Russia, but from also Saudi Arabia and other Gulf states, which is an absolute. I mean, that's going to destroy the petrodollar and therefore create even worse inflation than we see now, despite what interest rates do. And this was all known, as I've said many times from the very beginning. The sanctions were set up to impact America and the West far more than Russia. I mean, Russia doesn't sell any oil for worth speaking of to the U.S. And Europe is in a situation where they are basically at Russia's mercy just to heat their homes or have any kind of energy whatsoever. So they'll just buy it and they'll buy it in rubles. So it's a sanction against the West, really. And it's also interesting to note that India and China have had a very belligerent recent history with clashes at the border and like you know relatively regular threats of war. And what we've done by through our genius foreign policy, or it's maybe designed, if you think like I do, is push all of these countries together, and they don't necessarily have what normies or traditional thinking people would say geopolitical interests aligned, other than they are all being sort of pushed by the U.S. to into a corner. All right, so since the beginning of the invasion of Ukraine, there has been a running narrative of Western media that sanctions and the removal of Russian access to the SWIFT system would crush the country within a few months, leaving them penniless and unable to project military power. This hasn't happened. Of course, it hasn't happened because they continue to sell their oil, and now they have all the leverage in the world to force people to buy it in rubles, which means that countries have to stockpile rubles if they want to buy Russian oil, rubles instead of U.S. dollars. They knew this at the State Department when they created these sanctions, that they're not stupid. Presumably, they all went to Yale and Harvard, really Yale with their skull and bones shit, but they knew it happened. They knew what would happen. A picture was painted by journalists and politicians of a completely isolated Russia, destroyed by a global cancel culture campaign that would denation them. And all the useful idiots here in the U.S. really did believe in the power of their cancel culture. They all believed that if you just got on board like a bunch of cliquey-ish middle school girls, you could just take that, Putin. But in reality, Russian trade, especially the oil trade, has expanded. Both China and India have increased their purchases of Russian oil while enjoying discounted prices. Simultaneously, Europe and the US are suffering from oil and gas inflation, and the EU is cutting vital oil and gas supplies from Russia. And then the US also, of course, has cut production by administration dictate. And so, where are they getting it, I wonder? Any economist with a brain and a familiarity with the BRICS would have predicted this outcome, but the bias within the mainstream media is a powerful thing. If there were any doubts that the BRICS might might distance themselves from Russia, they were put to rest in the BRICS statement on the Ukraine situation. While supporting humanitarian efforts with the Ukraine, as well as diplomatic solutions, the BRIC members took swipes at NATO countries for opportunism and instigation. In other words, there will be no breakup of the BRIC countries with Russia, um, and BRIC markets will continue to remain open to them. Then this means that Russia's war with Ukraine will be sustainable for many months to come, which means the sanctions and economic warfare will continue for many months to come. Supply chain disruptions will continue unabated as Russian commodities remain off the market for the West. And this will add to the already high inflation we are currently dealing with. Of course, it will. And here's another thing to just consider. Um, this is impacting primarily Europe because they're the ones who are highly dependent on uh, Russian fertilizer, Russian oil, Russian gas, Russian wheat, because of their just geographic proximity. The U.S. has less exposure to this, but it seems like the administration is doing everything possible to increase that exposure um, by paying farmers to stop producing, which isn't in fact happening both here and in Canada and in the UK at least, and by making it extremely difficult for oil production to take place in the United States. So even though we may have the resources to do this, one might interpret current policy as attempting to make us as exposed to the same sort of pressures uh, that Europe is exposed to as possible. So here's the deal. We have done everything to build up these BRIC countries that you could possibly think of. Russia has we've basically just built infrastructure, and by we I mean the West, to pipe in as much natural gas as humanly possible into Europe. That's created a complete dependency on Russia for energy there. We have basically cut oil production and pipelines all over the U.S. to make us more dependent on foreign oil and on global oil markets, which the prices are rising. And oil is relatively regional in pricing to some degree. It's not just an international market. Like you can buy oil that's just being piped in from West Texas if you want to refine it in Houston or Louisiana or something, cheaper than if you were to buy the same quality product that has to be transported across the world. So we could avoid this, but we're choosing not to. So, and then these countries, we have, let's say, with Russia, rather India and China specifically, we have we have offshored tons of manufacturing, and in the case of India, we've sent over tons of more white collar uh, corporate functions as well. So these countries have booming economies. There, a lot of what the U.S. used to be has already been transferred over there, and there's just this sort of like colonialist type core within these corporations that lord over these the basic the actual substance of these corporations that are all based in Russia and China, and if not there, then in countries within their spheres of influence like Vietnam or Thailand or Taiwan. To be honest, and I mean Taiwan is within China's sphere of influence. All right, so the situation, let's see, further economic escalation could even lead BRIC alliance to engaging in trade warfare as well. The situation has a powder keg potential beyond anything the world has seen in decades. Yeah, and it's becoming a an alliance basically. It's sort of polarizing into the West, the decrepit, dying, decadent, apparently suicidal West against a very robust and upcoming coalition of countries like India and Brazil, especially, that have a huge amount of potential and are rapidly advancing, and China, which is sort of emerging as a much more energetic peer to the United States, and Russia, which is it's always been a powerhouse, and South Africa. I don't know why that one's in there. They seem to have a lot of problems, but there's plenty of I don't know, intellectual capacity there, so maybe they have a shot too. So that's just something interesting, because traditionally the U.S. might look at, at least say India here as an ally, against these countries. But what we're doing is very intentionally pushing these countries together into a coalition that's going to be completely counter to Western interests. And at the same time as we're doing that, we are very, very clearly making ourselves at a disadvantage in this sort of conflict. So it makes you wonder what the policymakers in Western countries, if they have some sort of deal where they get to come out on the back end of this, as long as they facilitate the rise of these BRIC countries, they get to come out on the upside. And if you, and this is getting a little bit esoteric here, not in like weird occult terms, but just sort of off topic. If you just read a lot of the thinking of the people who set up the World Economic Forum and the people who really push this like transatlantic uh, sort of combination that NATO is really just an example of, uh, then you know that they kind of see there being a need for a transition of power, peacefully or through internal subversion in the West to China, or I guess these BRICS countries, more generally, in order to avoid a war as the U.S. declines and the West declines, and sort of we trade places in the world. So that's something to think about, and the evidence all points to controlled demolition of Western civilization. So also, please share, like, if you like this content. Some of the stuff I'm going to start putting up here is just really not YouTube friendly. So also find me on Locals, under the same name, which is now Global Narc, because I got sort of pinged for using globalist in my name. That's not It's not a preferred term by the tech overlords anymore. But please share, like, and follow me on Locals.